This is Dr. Eric Morris, the Director of Forensics at Missouri State University. This is a discussion on stock issues generally and how they relate specifically to National Forensic Association Lincoln-Douglas debate. It is a subtitled Stock Issues Analysis of the Building Blocks of Policy Analysis. I want to start by discussing the history of stock issues. And the history of stock issues actually takes us a good deal of the way back, all the way to Hermagoras, who is writing in the 1st century BC. Hermagoras has 4 specific issues that he considers to be substantial or relevant questions. The first of these is called conjecture, and Hermagoras thinks of each of these 4, by the way, as a type of stasis, which some people will pronounce stasis, which is a point of clash, a point of disagreement, a place where argument stops because one person takes one side, one person takes another side. So argument might move along, and then all of a sudden we have a point where we disagree, and then we kind of come to a screeching halt, and we feel like it's necessary to work through and resolve that disagreement. So an issue is a place where we have a disagreement with each other. It is a place where there is an existence of stasis, and Hermagoras thought that there were really 4 questions where you might end up with stasis, but you wouldn't have disagreement in all of these necessarily each time. The first of these was called conjecture, which would be the disagreement over whether or not there is a problem. So if both sides kind of agree to what the problem, there is a problem, then there is no stasis here. But if there's some dispute over whether the problem exists, then conjecture can become a point of stasis. A second one would be the question of definition, which is what is the essence of the problem. So both sides might agree that there is some kind of a problem, but they may disagree over what its causes are, or over what makes it a problem, or whether it's a problem in all circumstances. So contemplate for a second the question of poverty. There might be differences of agreement about whether poverty is a problem, which would be conjecture, but most often people would perhaps agree that poverty is a problem, but might disagree over the root causes of it, or the proximate causes, or maybe who is responsible for it, and maybe even who is responsible for it in this situation or that situation. And so a lot of the dispute over that particular issue would be a dispute over definition more than over conjecture. The third that Hermagoras identified was what was called quality, which is basically how serious is the problem? How significant is the problem? Does it need to be addressed? How urgent is it? And the degree of urgency might also have something to do with the amount of risk or the amount of cost that you're willing to undertake to solve it. So there could be some disagreement over whether it's a very serious problem or not. So in the current controversy over global warming, there are certainly differences of opinion about whether it even exists as a problem or what the cause of it is, but then there are also people who kind of say this is maybe not a problem that needs to be addressed immediately today, but perhaps a problem that needs to be, we need to lay the groundwork to address it over time as we study it more. And so there are other people that would say it is immediate, serious, and demands action now and probably a while ago as well. So there'd be some differences over how serious it is and what is the quality of it. The final is the objection, and objection only occurs if there's disagreement. But basically the question is should or should not action be taken? And in Hermagoras' day, this is more of a should or shouldn't action be taken by us, either you and I or the government that we are a part of or something to that effect. So if the action is agreed upon, you'll actually run through this process pretty fast. But if there's disagreement over whether an action is, beneficial or not beneficial, then the nature of that disagreement, the issue, could be described as an objection, and that is a point of stasis or a point of disagreement. Now, Hermagoras is not the only person who's writing about this. I'm not going to suggest that that nothing happened between the 1st century BC and Lee Holtzen, but there were actually many people who interrogated Hermagoras' categories and redefined them and tried to put particular boundaries on them, etc. Lee Holtzen, writing in 1922, however, had a fairly simplified version of this that I think makes a lot of sense. It's not widely used in debate, but nonetheless it is something that I like to introduced to people just because of the simplicity of thinking. Lee Holtzen suggests that there are 4 places where disagreements might occur: ill, blame, cure, and cost. Ill, the question is what is wrong, what is the problem? That what would go with that is like kind of a how bad is it really a problem, etc. Blame is kind of the who or what is responsible. Certainly you see a lot of this in political discussions about problems, but it's not just who is responsible, it's also what is responsible, what is the cause, why does it happen? And are the current policies responsible? Are private actors responsible, etc.? Cure is a proposal to fix it, and related to cure is the notion of whether the proposal would actually fix it. Would it be effective in curing or remedying or reducing the problem? And then finally, the question of cost. What are the drawbacks to the cure? Cost is not necessarily measured in dollars. It can also be measured in trade-offs, resource trade-offs, focus trade-offs, and consequences of changing things, whether they're known or unknown, but they all would fall under the category of cost. And I suppose you could say that if the costs of change outweigh the benefits, that you ought to change. If the benefits are outweighed by the cost, then you probably shouldn't change. But that may not be a very systematic thing in Holtzen. He's just trying to identify kind of the categories of argument. The modern stock issues, which are still widely used in many formats of debate and specifically encouraged in NFA-LD debate, really you can find pieces of them before that, but as a system of analysis, some of the pieces don't come into place until the 1960s. I've put them in a different order here because, as you might tell by reading down the left-hand column, there is an acronym that many high school debaters use to help recall these, and it's a fairly useful acronym. So solvency is a question of whether or not a proposal or plan that's advocated is enough to solve a problem. Harms, which need to be significant, are how bad is the thing, what is the problem. Inherency is how it relates to the current system, the current policies, what causes it, whether or not the current system could fix it on its own, or whether or not we need to change things. Topicality is whether or not the proposal that's under discussion relates to the overall topic for the debate, which is really going to be its own issue, and we'll talk about that in much more detail. And then significance, sometimes people would say significance is just a modifier to harms. There needs to be a significant harm. Some people would say, well, yeah, there's harms, but then there's also significance. So you might compare like a hangnail to loss of life. A hangnail hurts, so it's a harm, but it's probably not a qualitatively significant harm. If there, you could say that it's a pretty significant harm that somebody died, but on the other hand, thousands and thousands of people die every day, so it might be that you wouldn't, it might be that if the lack of insurance, for example, was causing people to experience premature deaths and that happened 10 times a year, some people would say that's not really worth reorganizing the healthcare system to solve. But if it was causing 20,000 people a year to experience premature deaths, maybe that's a significant enough number of people to cause intervention. Certainly, there are studies that had attributed the yearly death tolls from highway fatalities in the tens of thousands and the yearly death tolls from tobacco use just a few years back in the several hundreds of thousands. And so it was easier for people to kind of argue there's really a significant problem that needs to be addressed here than, for example, with mercury poisoning that might kill a few people a year. Still qualitatively significant for those people, but not as numerically significant. There is a tendency when people start talking about stock issues to equate stock issues as voting issues. And so many freshman debaters are taught that the affirmative has to win each stock issue and the negative can win by defeating the affirmative on any one of the stock issues. So the affirmative would initially lay out say here's a harm, here's why the status quo causes it, here's our proposal that solves it. The harm is significant, of course, and then that the affirmative is under the topic, and if the negative could successfully attack and defeat any one of those arguments, then the negative would win. And so from that perspective, a stock issue could be viewed as a voting issue. Not everyone agrees with the voting issue formulation. I know of a lot of critics who would say topicality is a voting issue, but the other ones usually are not. I know of people that would say, well, these things are voting issues if the negative wins them absolutely, if there is actually no solvency, no benefit from the plan, but if there is just a minimization of it, maybe it's not a voting issue. So there is it's one thing to say these are areas of discussion, and another thing to say that these are what the entire debate is about or not about. Now, the primary thing that we're going to do today is to try and unpack some of the issues related to modern stock issues. And so I'm going to kind of go through them in more of problem solution order here instead of in the acronym order that we just mentioned. We'll start with harms, the question of is there a problem? The question of the problem might be viewed both quantitatively and qualitatively. So what is the significance of the harm? Is it people dying? Is it people getting sick? Is it human suffering? Is it some kind of a problem for justice, a violation of people's rights, a violation of people's privileges that they consider to be important privileges, some kind of a destruction of the quality of life? And the quantitative question is a question of more of how many people are affected or how many non-people are affected. So, for example, if your claim is that it's undesirable to eat meat because eating meat causes animal suffering, the number of beings that you might count on that wouldn't necessarily be limited to the 7 billion people on the planet, but it could be limited to billions and billions of other beings of various kinds, animals, who may experience some kind of suffering and who might, under some systems, like kind of count for the purpose of weighing costs and benefits. So there is a question of whether or not there is qualitative significance, and also a question of whether or not there is quantitative significance. And hopefully there are both of them if you're really trying to justify a change. Now, harms also address the question of whether or not there's a current harm versus a projected or potential harm. So if I could demonstrate that each year there are a certain number of people who are dying from diseases that have a relationship to tobacco use, or a smaller subset that are dying from, say, the tobacco use of others, like from secondhand smoke, I might be able to provide studies that suggest that there are, thousands or hundreds of thousands of deaths from one of those causes year in, year out, all the time. And obviously, those kinds of things really create a felt need and are very effective. But some of the bigger concerns that people actually operate under are the projected potentials. So the United States spent $1 trillion removing Saddam Hussein from power, and yes, you could find current problems, certainly because he was a dictator and because the loss of life in Iraq whenever his rule was threatened that he used to kind of reestablish order was, significant, as in the, tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of people getting killed fighting against the government. But a lot of what really mobilized the Iraq War was not the current concerns or the current harms, but instead the potential future ones. So a concern over whether over time Hussein would attack again countries like Kuwait or Saudi Arabia or Iran, or whether he would develop nuclear weapons or even chemical and biological weapons, whether those would be used on his own people, whether they might be used on Israel, all the possibilities projecting what would happen in the future if he were to remain in power. And a lot of those concerns are the concerns that really motivated the policy change, which was to declare war on him in the year 2003. So not just current, but projected potential harms. You could also distinguish between harms that are systemic versus episodic. And I'm going to stick around on the Iraq and the Saddam Hussein example, because you could have justified the Iraq war based upon the death toll that occurred under Saddam. And there was a systemic element of that. In other words, every year there were probably at least a few hundred to maybe even a few thousand people who, for one reason or another, were killed by the regime in their attempt to not only maintain power, but also to consolidate power, to eliminate people that they thought were threats to their own power. And so there was kind of a certain death toll that was pretty systemic and pretty even. But some people looked at the regime of Saddam Hussein and they said this guy is really, really murderous because in the late 1980s, in order to like get and regionally consolidate power, the wars that kind of brought him into power result in the extermination of tens to hundreds of thousands of people. And in right after the first Gulf War in 1991, there were uprisings against him, which he put down by force, and that resulted in the uh, exterminations of a lot of people in certain areas of Iraq that you could probably count that death toll in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps even approaching a million. So I've seen people that kind of said, like, add up the whole death toll divided by the number of years he's in charge, and this guy is killing 30 or 40,000 people a year. But the truth is, he's probably killing a few hundred to 1,000 people in a typical year, and then in a couple of episodes where there was a serious threat to his power, the death tolls went way up. And so those are bad things in either case, but episodic events do not always occur, may or may not occur in the future. Systemic events are kind of an ongoing process or problem. And there might be reasons to focus more energy on systemic concerns or more energy on episodic concerns. So there are different ways of looking at what is a harm or what is potential harm. One of the ways in which people, specifically in some other forms of debate, look at harms is to talk about them in terms of the language of probability, magnitude, and time frame. So probability, and again we're imagining here a future projected harm, is what's the degree of certainty that it will happen? Is it pretty much 100% guaranteed to happen, as would be a systemic harm that happens year after year? Is it a very low probability concern, but still a legitimate one? So you could try and, there are people who did mathematical analysis saying what's the chance that the United States and the USSR during the Cold War would launch their full nuclear weapons arsenals against each other. And I've seen people that put the probability of that in any given year at 1% or 1/10 of 1%. But given the loss of life would be in the hundreds of millions, if not in the billions, from such an episode, even a low probability of it would be something that you really want to kind of work to reduce the probability. Reducing the probability of something like that from 1/10 of 1% to 1/100th of 1% would actually be a huge benefit, even though the probability is not really high in either case. Magnitude is kind of the terminal potential impact of something. So if I kind of said there is a 10% risk that 100,000 people die, or a 100% risk that 10,000 people die, you could sort of say that the probability is times the magnitude makes those two equal, but one of them is obviously much higher magnitude because more people would be affected by it. So mathematically, sometimes you might say that what's the total possibility of an impact of a harm occurring, and then what is the likelihood of that occurring, probability times magnitude. People, however, also draw the distinction of time frame, because it may be that there are problems that need to be addressed, but some problems are more immediately urgent than other problems. So we could kind of say there's a rise in a certain ideology somewhere, and it's a really dangerous ideology. And if the people who believe that ideology ever actually took over a government to implement it, it would be bad. So we should probably kind of fight against it, but it may not be as big of a priority as managing the concerns that we have immediately today. Certainly, if you take a look at what what the State Department is up to or what the Defense Department is up to, they're up to primarily pushing back against threats that exist today and against threats that they imagine might evolve over the near term. They might have somebody at a desk somewhere who's studying a threat that wouldn't evolve for 50 or 100 years, but honestly, they're not going to devote a lot of resources to that. We tend to devote resources to whatever is immediate. When you're driving a car down the street, you're far more concerned about the things that are imminent collision potentials than you are about the fact that 20 miles down the road there might be a dangerous stretch of road, or 20 miles down the road there might be a bunch of cars that are on a collision course with you. You kind of worry about it more when it becomes close, because the farther out it is, the more time you have to make adjustments. And so some people by this logic say you need to focus on things that could come to roost fairly quickly ahead of things that wouldn't come to roost for a long time and that you might have a long time to figure out a solution to before they become an issue. I'll give you one more example to kind of clarify this. If you ever do a research on kind of like what are some of the long-term threats that are facing humanity, one of the things that you might find a little bit of research on is something called the telomere problem. Telomeres are the things that cause DNA to hold themselves together. DNA building the building block of life. Those are kind of important, and there is some evidence to suggest that over the course of generation after generation, the telomeres of human DNA are kind of weakening, and that might be a concern in terms of the longevity of the human race, but it would be a concern probably across, generation after generation, several generations into the future. Is it worth spending money to solve? Sure, but is it as urgent as trying to avoid a war in the near term? It probably isn't, which is why we spend a lot more time and energy on the near-term concerns than the telomere problem. Some people would also say that you can evaluate harms based upon their proximity. There's recently been controversies about a police shooting in the city of Ferguson, and that has perhaps hit people in Springfield a little harder since we are inside the same state as Ferguson. There are certainly questions of, questionably justified police use of force that happen several times a year, and the degree of proximity that they have seems to have a large effect on people. In fact, there are calamities of various types that cause substantial loss of life occurring around the world, and people in the United States often pay more attention to them if they're happening either in the United States or near the United States than they do if they're happening in a different corner of the globe. And so we do tend to evaluate concerns and the degree of energy and intensity we have over a concern based upon proximity. You may have heard someone argue that we need to reduce the amount of foreign aid we give to other countries because we need to solve problems here at home first. And there may or may not actually be a big trade-off between those two goals, but that's an argument from proximity, an argument that kind of says things that are closer to us are sort of more legitimately the concern of our nation than problems that are far away, and thus, based upon proximity, local concerns are more significant than distant concerns. And, if you're a politician, you definitely want to be attentive to local concerns because that's really what people are going to vote about more than distant concerns. Or when people say, voting is about the economy, they're really saying the economy affects us immediately now, whereas some of the other concerns that people have maybe affect somebody eventually, but not all of us immediately now. So there's a variety of ways of looking into harms. Honestly, any problem that you could name is probably worth at least thinking about a solution to, but clearly the more substantial the harm, the more urgent the solution, and the more risks you might be willing to undertake to try and address it. So harm is at least an area to address. It's possible, I guess, for an affirmative to say here's a harm, and for the negative to prove that the harm literally does not exist. If you found a study that says literally there is not a single person each year that dies from tobacco or mercury poisoning or automobile accidents, etc., then I suppose the harm could be reduced to zero. But most of the time, if the affirmative team says here's a harm, the negative doesn't usually say there's zero harm. They usually say it's not as bad as you said, it's getting better, there's some other ways that it's being solved. Maybe they would say there's no harm, but that's usually not the most effective strategy. The next category of argument is the question of inherency. And inherency is definitely an odd duck in the way that it's named. There are a series of articles written back in the 1960s that kind of started to discuss like whether or not problems with the current system were inherent to the structure of that system. And it is from those articles that the modern debate concept of inherency was born. Now, you can kind of see the root. Is that inherent? Is it like tied to it? Is it intrinsically a part of it? You can kind of see how the word inherency comes to be from its root term. And the word inherency draws attention to the status quo. The status quo is basically the way that we do things. So the status quo is a complex mix of laws, policies, legal doctrines, administrative practice, government regulations. You don't have to understand all of those in order to be able to discuss or debate them effectively, but the status quo is almost always bigger and more intricate than any debater will ever clarify. You've got to simplify it because you have time limits and honestly knowledge limits. Um, so the question of are the harms inherent to the status quo is a question of figuring out what's the cause, what's to blame for those harms, why are they occurring, what is the definition of the problem. And if you don't understand what's causing a problem, you're very unlikely to successfully solve it by just doing something. So you want to figure out what's causing it so that you can kind of take action appropriate to that problem. So one of the first parts of this is to try and figure out the current approach. In the context of moon policy, one of the things that you might want to try and figure out if you're debating it is what is our current approach generally to space exploration? What are NASA's primary priorities or missions? What's being funded, what's not being funded? What are they trying to achieve in the near term and the far term? So what is the current approach? On other kinds of topics where maybe you deal with environmental law, you might say, well, what are the current laws? What are those laws designed to do? Are they effective or not effective, etc. And typically, the affirmative team would say the current approach is ineffective and that the current approach causes some kind of a problem. Now, it may be that the current approach causes a problem. It may be that the current approach just doesn't effectively address a problem. But one way or another, you're going to say not only is there a problem, but that the current approach is not the right approach. So you need to ask questions like, what about it is wrong? Why does it cause problems? Why does it fail to address current problems? And with that idea, I have at least 5 terms of different kinds of inherency that people have spoken to over the years to describe this. The first of these, and the kind of the most sound, is what's called structural inherency. Structural inherency says there is a problem. That problem is built into current law. It's built into the way that the law is worded, requirements imposed by the law, etc. So if you were trying to write a case that said, let's fix Obamacare or repeal it, you might say, here's this problem built into the structure of Obamacare. The Affordable Care Act is this mandate that everyone must have insurance. If you do not have insurance, then you are subject to a penalty tax. And so that's built into the structure of the law. If I wanted to change that, I could easily, when structural inherency, I could easily prove that that was part of the current law that was kind of causing that problem. And usually if there's a cause, then there's a reason for that cause, something behind it. So a second kind of inherency that people speak about is an attitudinal one. The problem exists because there is a certain attitude. So now let's think about the police violence problem in the relationship to Ferguson. Perhaps there are structural problems in terms of how self-defense law works or how the self-defense burden of proof works under criminal law, but some people's reaction to policing issues say that there may be an attitude problem in that there may be police out there who criminalize someone, like look at them as a criminal based upon race or based upon their actions, not based upon like the way they carry themselves as opposed to based upon whether or not they have violated the law or appear to be violating the law. And so I might say the problem here isn't so much with like police law, it might be with the attitudes of some police officers. And whether it was all police officers or just a few might really have a significant effect on whether or not I, felt like we needed to solve the problem or how we might go about it. Now, a slightly weaker version is called gap inherency. Gap inherency is just kind of like we recognize there's a problem, but we don't know what to do about it. So we're just not really doing anything about it, or whatever we're doing isn't enough to solve the problem. So you could say there is a problem because there are lots of children in this country that do not have an effective educational experience prior to starting kindergarten. So the pre-K years, which are extremely important for language development, moral development, understanding of concepts, etc. You could say there's sort of this educational problem. Now, we have a proposal to solve that, which is to provide programs like Head Start, which is a pre-kindergarten program that people are eligible for based upon their wealth. But I might say Head Start doesn't really apply to everybody, and even though it theoretically should apply to everybody, it's never had the funding to actually serve everyone who is technically eligible for it. It's always been funded at no more than about 10% of what the actual need probably is. So, and it's not like somebody somewhere kind of said like we want to make sure 90% of the children are denied Head Start. It's more that money's scarce, and so the amount allocated year in, year out is perhaps about 10% of what it really needs to be. So I could say there's just this gap. Like we've got a program, it's a good idea, but we're just not doing enough of it. And so there's, kind of this absence that's there, and that would be gap inherency. A fourth kind of inherency is existential. Existential is almost like saying we don't notice the problem. So if you ask yourself, what was the United States government doing to fight global warming in the 1960s or the 1970s? The answer is nothing, because even though global warming might have existed, and even though there may have been people that even used the phrase or understood the theory, it was not widespread in its understanding, and so there was just kind of like a lack of policy, just nothing happening at all. You could also go back to the 1970s and 1980s and say, what is the United States doing to prevent an asteroid from colliding, like a large asteroid from colliding with the Earth and causing considerable amounts of disruption now? And the answer was, again, not that we wanted asteroids to hit us, but really it just wasn't acknowledged as a significant concern or problem, so there was just no policy whatsoever. Um, so, existential inherency, just like the mere existence of the problem, kind of suggests that there's something that's causing or not solving it. And then the final version of it, and this is something that people were playing with back in the 1970s, and it kind of got discarded as not a very useful concept, was the question of core motive. Getting to the question of why is it that good people do bad things? What's the root of evil? What's the root of bad decision making? What is the core underlying motive? And of course, explaining all of that can become very difficult. And there were negative teams that were kind of saying, if the status quo only knew about the affirmative case, then they would fix it. So your problem's not really inherent; it's just a lack of knowledge, etc. Ultimately, a lot of people in debate abandoned this line of thinking, figuring that it wasn't really productive or leading to anything good. But there are articles about it from the 1970s for sure. Now, not every negative team spends time attacking the concept of inherency. Not every negative team tries to say the status quo is solving this problem and here's how we're doing it. And one of the reasons why negatives don't sometimes abandon this line of attack entirely is because negatives ultimately are trying to persuade the judge that the plan's a bad idea. And so to suggest that there are a whole bunch of things similar to the plan that have already been done may make it much harder for the negative to explain why the plan itself would be different enough to cause an actual, problem or a drawback. So if you take a look at the history of the healthcare debate, one of the peculiar things of it is that the thing that's known as Obamacare, although it's its own kind of bill, actually had its intellectual roots in a proposal from the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative group. Has a lot of parallels to the healthcare plan that the Republicans proposed in the early 1990s to combat Hillary Clinton's proposal from the Clinton administration, and has a lot of similarities with the proposal that was kind of put into place by Mitt Romney in Massachusetts that at least some people thought was a fairly effective approach. So that line of attack made it a little bit more difficult in some circles for Republicans to kind of argue consistently against the Affordable Care Act, because a lot of the drawbacks that they might point to in the Affordable Care Act would have been true in some other proposals that had come from their party, their side of the aisle, etc. And so some of them dug in, like Mitt Romney, since he had something to do with Massachusetts, kind of had to say, my approach in Massachusetts was fine, and here's how yours is different, and that's the drawback with it. But some of the other Republicans just kind of like sidestepped these questions completely and launched attacks against Obamacare that would have applied equally to all of the Republican proposals, and if they weren't closely associated with their proposals, then they could do that. In other words, pointing out current attempts might reduce the strategic options available to you if you are opposing a policy change. And so it's not necessarily always a good idea to emphasize that. It might also be that it kind of agrees with too much of the definition of the problem. If you want to say, well, maybe not everybody should be insured, or maybe you should only be insured if you can afford it, then you probably don't want to defend a current system which does insure some people who are not able to afford insurance, etc. The final thing I want to mention under inherency is that the status quo is not just a snapshot of the current laws and approaches. It's really an evolving question. And so when people, for example, talk about Supreme Court decisions and the logic by which the Supreme Court reaches those decisions, they speak about it not just in terms of what did the court decide in this one instance, but also how will the principles addressed by the court kind of evolve into other things. There was recently a decision in the case of Hobby Lobby that had to do with whether or not the Obamacare birth control mandate applies when it's not a religious organization per se, but a closely held business where the people who hold the business, the owners, have strongly held moral beliefs against birth control. Do they really have to pay for their employees to have birth control? And the court said basically that they didn't, but there's a lot of concern that the reasoning process there could kind of be the opening end of a wedge by which people start getting to opt out of complying with a number of laws based upon religious beliefs, which could be, a very interesting problem, to say the least, in the law. So the other court decisions that take the principle from Hobby Lobby and apply it in other situations, it's just too soon for those to have occurred. But you could clearly find research saying that the way that the status quo will become something. Another way to think about it is to think about the recent experiments in legalization of marijuana in Colorado and Washington, or legalization of medical marijuana in about 20 other places. You might be able to say that there's a strong trend in this direction, and that the status quo isn't just to have it be legal here and illegal there. The status quo is to kind of have it slowly evolve towards legality state by state as states decide they want it, and then have each of them experiment with how to regulate it and learn from each other's experiments. So it may be that it's a better idea to kind of do that step by step than it is to kind of make it legal across the United States immediately today. So the status quo may be an evolving concept, and if the status quo can evolve in a good direction, it could also evolve in kind of a bad direction. One of the reasons why you might ask the Supreme Court to overturn the Hobby Lobby decision is because maybe the decision isn't that appalling on its own grounds, but because it could lead to some problems that are extremely appalling. So the status quo could evolve in multiple directions. There are people who in the 1970s and 1980s would have used the term minor repair to indicate this concept. So, if you could kind of say the status quo's got the basic approach right, but it's not really implementing it fully and completely, and over time we do reevaluate approaches. We tend to give more money to things that are in fact working, and so a negative might argue to look at the status quo not just as where it is on this particular date, but also where it's going toward. So imagine the status quo with minor alterations or minor repairs. And would that status quo be sufficient to solve whatever problem we're talking about? The next category that is commonly used is called solvency. And solvency is kind of a huge category. It just consists of a whole bunch of interlocking components. So one of the first things is that in a policy debate, the affirmative team is expected to put forward a proposal, a plan to solve the problem. And usually part of the affirmative speech will be devoted to reading the text of that plan. And the degree of specificity expected in the text of that plan varies dramatically, in my experience, from type of activity. So in another form of debate where we participate, some of the plan texts are literally one sentence long, and they sound like the resolution with 3 or 4 qualifying terms added. And, so it's just kind of like, here's this concept or this idea. In high school policy debate, especially in this area of the country, plan texts will typically discuss not only what should change in the law, but also what agency or board or administration should oversee those changes, and how they might come up with the money to pay for those changes, and what might happen in terms of compliance to enforce the law if people should violate it. So, Obamacare couldn't just say everyone is required to have insurance. There needs to be kind of a mechanism of what happens if you refuse, and then the government over time could eventually, give you a tax penalty, and what is the burden of proof for that, and do you have to show you have insurance versus does the IRS have to show that you don't? All of those kinds of questions are really important questions if you're building an actual law, but maybe not quite as important of questions if you're speaking about an idea or a principle. So there's a lot of difference between formats of debate on the expectations of a plan text in terms of how specific does it need to be versus how vague might it be. Now, in this area, I want to say that NFA-LD as a specific format of debate tends to, in my experience, err in the direction of specificity, whereas some other forms of debate err in the direction of ambiguity. So you could theoretically say, well, to vote affirmative is to endorse an idea or a legal doctrine, but a lot of times in NFA-LD, the affirmative will advocate a very specific proposal that contemplates questions of who does it, as well as how is it done, as well as how is it paid for, as well as what do you do if people refuse to comply with it, what are the particular processes. In the context of a moon base, you would perhaps specify not only what kinds of resources that you're going to use, but if there were like 4 different ways of doing it, you might want to say which one of them you're willing to defend. So there's a lot of potential to demand more specification from an affirmative team, and negatives do win a fair number of rounds, essentially complaining about the plan wasn't specific enough in the right sorts of ways. One of the things that people have done to deal with this is that they've sometimes found proposals that were, say examples of bills that Congress could pass. Here's this bill that has not yet been passed, Senate Bill 236 or something, and so we are advocating that it be passed, or we're advocating that it be passed with these 2 modifications to it. That's a highly specific plan text and probably would meet anyone's concerns because they could look up the bill and see what every sentence of it said if they wanted to. Also related to with plan text is the question of advocacy. Now clearly if the affirmative is proposing a plan text, then they are advocating it. But one of the things that we expect in debate generally is that there be outside source support for most of the claims that you make. So sometimes people demand that a plan text have an advocate. In other words, that your proposal be not just your idea, but also an idea that you've found someone out there who actually advocates. And maybe they don't advocate it in all of the details, but at least they advocate it as a general course of action. And so there may be cross-examination questions and theory arguments based upon whether or not the evidence that you read to prove that your plan solves really matches the details of what your plan actually does. And that is a question of having a solvency advocate, having an outside source that supports the proposal. Now, solvency isn't just a sort of a procedural question about do you get to advocate this plan? Is it specific enough? Does somebody else agree with it? It is also a question of whether or not the plan under scrutiny would actually be effective. And so one of the things that a negative might do is to assert that it would be ineffective for a variety of reasons. One kind of attack is an attack on workability, which is basically to say that the proposal as outlined wouldn't functionally work, that it's missing important parts. Oftentimes workability is related to ambiguity. It's not clear how this would work or who would do what, or how you would deal with things. Perhaps it relies upon concepts that cannot be clearly explained or identified, and those are all workability problems. A second way to think about it is to use the terms PMA, PMN, which are basically plan, meet, advantage, plan, meet, need. Does the plan solve a particular problem, a particular need, a particular harm? Does it solve it completely or just partially? Or if the affirmative said, here's 3 benefits to our plan, is the plan really enough to solve for each of those 3 benefits, or maybe some of those advantages shouldn't be put for the affirmative because the plan isn't good enough to actually completely resolve those questions. So sometimes this is a question of degree. I recall an affirmative case, this is a high school affirmative case, which took proposed taking a lot of the toxic waste that is produced and incinerating it, but since incinerators tend to generate toxic fumes that can harm people who live nearby, the proposal was to put it all on ships and go out and incinerate it 300 or 400 miles off of a coastline. And there's not really a lot of ocean life. There's not a lot of stuff near the surface of the ocean 300 or 400 miles out. There's not a lot of fish. There's not a lot of anything. So it's not really going to get into the food chain. In most cases, it will kind of dissipate into the atmosphere. It's really dangerous to be close to incineration, but maybe not dangerous to be hundreds of miles away from it. So I recall people who said that this particular method could safely dispose of 99.99% of toxic waste. And I recall, at least in one circumstance, a debater saying you should lose because 99.99% is not 100%. You don't solve the problem completely. You just solved, almost all of it. Well, that's probably good enough. To substantially reduce a problem, even if you couldn't get rid of it, is probably good enough. There are people who will come out after Ferguson with proposals for how should you change the burden of proof for self-defense, or how should you oversee police, and none of those proposals will necessarily be tested on whether or not it would take the number of police shootings to zero in the future. The question is only whether or not it would reduce them meaningfully, whether or not it would be effective and thus save some lives, even if you could not save all future lives. So does it meet the need? Does it meet the advantage? Does it solve for the advantage? Another concern related to solvency is the question of alternative causes and sufficiency. So now assume a proposal to deal with global warming. And the proposal has the United States government change the incentives to shift a significant amount of our energy production from coal to production from solar and wind energy. Now, there are lots of alternative causes to global warming that might not be addressed by a proposal such as that. For example, it might only apply inside the United States, and it may be that over time China and India and Russia, etc., will have a lot more contribution to global warming than the affirmative can solve. A second issue might be that coal is only one of the things that creates carbon dioxide. There may be other forms of certainly gasoline from cars creates some carbon dioxide. Certainly natural gas creates some offset carbon dioxide. Agriculture certainly creates some. So it may be that it doesn't solve for those kinds of concerns. And it may be that there are other things besides carbon dioxide that cause global warming, such as methane. Methane released by the belching of cows, methane released by the process of drilling for gasoline. And it may be, in addition to methane, that there are other factors that contribute to it. So it could be that the affirmative proposes to solve global warming, but really solves for one cause of it, not completely in one nation on the planet. And so now all of a sudden something that seems like a huge problem, the affirmative has maybe 10% of a solution to it. Is 10% enough of a reason to take action? Yeah, if there's no drawbacks to it, probably it is. But it's not enough to solve the problem completely, because there's all these other things that are alternative causes that mean that the plan isn't really sufficient. Identifying those is really an important and useful thing for the negative to do, even if it may not be enough to win around on its own. One question related to solvency is the question of compliance. Will people comply with it? Will they follow through with it, etc.? So this is a problem that people tend to run into when they're advocating, for example, for gun control, because there's such a strong history of private ownership of firearms in the United States. There are significant questions about whether or not, under a gun control regime, you could actually remove the guns from people's hands, and whether you could remove them from everybody. So the NRA back in the 70s had a slogan, if guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns, pointing out that there are some people that are very unlikely to comply with the law, and there may be a lot of people who don't think of themselves as outlaws who would be unwilling to comply with that specific law, even if they are happy to comply with other laws. So how do you deal with the problem of non-compliance? How do you get sufficient compliance? And a lot of energy has been expended on the side of people that are sort of on the gun control side to say, how do we deal with the black market for guns, and how do we deal with the like raw number of guns that are out there? Because if there are 70 or 80 million guns in circulation, no matter what you do to ban them, people are going to end up with them. So are the things you can do like buyback programs, et cetera, that sort of pull them out of circulation. And that's an example of something where if you were really talking about gun control, you might run into huge problems on the question of compliance. The final thing I might say is that sometimes people also talk about solvency in terms of secondary effects. So if I had a proposal that said we're going to shift and reduce the number of coal plants and replace them with solar and wind, maybe that on its face solves for 10% of the contribution from the U.S. to global warming through our energy production, but maybe I could find research that suggests that by reducing the cost of solar and wind and making there be more of a market for it, that it would start replacing other fossil fuels in other categories. Perhaps I could find evidence saying if the United States found a quick and easy solution that other countries would follow our model. It's not that China is wanting global warming to happen, it's that they're wanting to develop their economy for their people, and if there was a cleaner way to do it that cost about the same, they'd probably choose the cleaner path. So it could be that there are some effects of the plan working properly that will kind of cause more solvency to kind of accumulate over time. And so this is all related to the bigger question of solvency. Is the plan sufficient to solve the problem, or does it solve it enough that it's worth doing? The next concern is not one we're going to get into to a great extent right now. It's called topicality. Basically, the question is, does the plan fall under the topic? So a long time ago, the resolution was the subject of the debate, and then over time, the plan has tended to become the subject of the debate, and now the resolution is viewed as a parameter. This point of view is called parametrics. So you could say the resolution creates a fence, and the affirmative needs to choose their plan from something inside the fence. So it's topical, but then once you demonstrate it's inside the fence, then that becomes the topic of the debate, and the negative has to say your plan's a bad idea. To decide whether or not the plan is inside the fence, you have to come up with definitions. What do the words in the topic mean? You have to prove that the affirmative plan is outside of the bounds of the fence, which is called a violation. Here's how you're not really about a moon resource, or here's how the resource you're talking about isn't really an energy resource, etc. There needs to be, oftentimes, if you can demonstrate that the affirmative is outside of the definition, there might be some other definition where they're okay. So a lot of times you end up with saying, like, what definition should we use? Should we use a legal definition? Should we use a definition that defines a phrase as opposed to two words separately, etc.? Maybe there are reasons to prefer one definition over another. And then the negative will try and win that topicality should be a voting issue, which in NFA LD it pretty much is, but in some forms of debate, maybe not. And then you ultimately end up, in most debates that are really about topicality, you'll have kind of an interpretation for the affirmative, an interpretation for the negative, and the first question the judge has to decide is which interpretation is better, which one should I use, and then once they decide which interpretation to use, then they figure out if the plan is inside the fence or outside the fence. And if it's outside, they usually vote on that question alone. People also talk about whether or not all parts of the plan are topical, so maybe the plan does 5 things and 3 of them are topical and 2 of them are not. Those 2 might be called extra topical, and maybe that's a voting issue and maybe it's not, so those are all big dispute over that. And then sometimes you could say that the affirmative is topical, but it's only topical by its effects. So let's say on the moon topic that the affirmative doesn't really mandate us going to the moon, but they do mandate that NASA develop a new, better kind of replacement for the space shuttle, and then they read evidence saying that if we had a less expensive replacement of the space shuttle, that we would use it to colonize the moon and develop resources there. Now the plan itself didn't meet the resolution, but the plan led to an effect which met the resolution, and is that good enough or not? There's certainly a dispute about that. Topicality is really a very different question from some of the other stock issues. A lot of times you would say that topicality is only an issue if the negative brings it up. And some people would say the negative has the burden to prove the affirmative isn't topical. whereas on most of these other stock issues, the affirmative has the initial burden to bring it up and the burden to prove it. So topicality is kind of an odd thing. It's in its own world, and we're going to devote a whole day of class discussion to getting into more details of it for that reason. There are other perspectives besides the stock issues perspective. Um, One other perspective is called the comparative advantage perspective, and this is the idea that we really make decisions by weighing costs and benefits. So if you're trying to decide, should I do this or do that, if it's a really important decision for you, you might pull out a piece of paper and kind of like make a pro and con list. Right, so here's the advantages, but then in this other column are the disadvantages, and you kind of look at them and think about them and decide that the advantages make more sense to you, so you do it, or that the disadvantages are overwhelming, so you don't. So, kind of thinking through advantage versus disadvantage is called a comparative advantage approach. And that approach has really transformed some forms of debate, but it's still a fairly conventional approach. So even though the NFA LD ethics guidelines say that it's a stock issues form of debate, as a practical question, a lot of people read cases where they say, here's the plan, and we didn't say here's the need, and here's the harm, and here's the inherency, and here's the solvency. They might say here's the plan, and then here's 3 benefits of it: advantage 1, advantage 2, and advantage 3. And that seems to be pretty widely accepted. It's just a different way of structuring it. Now, I would say you could still look at each advantage to say, is there really an impact? Is there a harm? Is the advantage inherent to the status quo? Does the plan really solve for the advantage? So you could do stock issue analysis of every advantage. Back in the 90s, people started talking about debate in terms of offense and defense, to kind of use a sports metaphor. So if you're playing a game of football, etc., you're not going to win if you score 0 points. You could at best tie, but probably not going to tie either. You have to get some offense or you will not win. At the same time, if you only play offense and you don't play defense, you're probably going to get outscored. So you kind of need to have some of both, but using the terms offense and defense may have some utility in thinking about arguments. So if I read an advantage to my affirmative case, to my plan, then I could say that advantage is a reason to vote for it, so that is an offensive argument. It's an actual benefit. If you come back against my advantage and say, it's not as true as you said 1,000 people a year die, it's actually only 10 people a year, I have certainly not proven that your plan's an actively a bad idea with that argument, but I've minimized your offense, so I've played defense against it. And the important concepts of offense and defense are really that under this perspective, the negative needs an offensive argument. Otherwise, the affirmative in their last speech is going to say, there's a problem, the plan might have a chance to solve some of it, why don't you give it a try? And if there's no drawback to giving it a try, the judge will probably say, yeah, we should give it a try. And so under this perspective, both the affirmative and the negative need to have offensive arguments, both advantages to the plan and disadvantages to the plan. And it puts the negative in a very different position if they have to do that. So that's one way of thinking about it. I think it's a productive way to think about it, honestly, but it is a perspective that has some interesting strategic implications, to say the least. There was a kind of affirmative approach that was popular in the 80s called goals criteria, where the affirmative would say, the current system has already set a goal but is not meeting the goal. You should vote for the plan as a way to meet the goal. And this was a way for the affirmative to use kind of the assumption that things are right in the status quo against the negative, and sort of say, well, you should assume the goal is a good idea because we already set this goal, but we just need to take different actions to meet it. So instead of talking about whether it's a good goal or not, we can just focus on how do you get there from here, which is a very narrow a way that the affirmative could narrow the debate down a little bit, and was pretty strategically effective in some of the ways that I've seen it deployed. The final thing I want to emphasize is that not everybody thinks that a stock issue is a voting issue. So just because the negative has drawn into question the inherency, or has minimized the harm, or has shown the affirmative doesn't solve the entirety of the problem, that may not be enough for the negative to win a debate. It may be that the negative needs to do that, but then also have an offensive argument show the plan is actively bad in some way or another. There are a few kinds of arguments that go beyond stock issues. And so when somebody says their stock issues approach to debate, they're really kind of trying to say that some of these other issues don't have as much weight. One of them is disadvantages, and pretty much everybody thinks disadvantages are relevant. So a disadvantage deals with the traditional stock issue called objection, or Holdson's stock issue called cost. It says, is there a drawback? So maybe there's a benefit to the plan, but the drawback is, more dangerous or more certain or faster. And so, on balance, you might say the disadvantage is bigger than the advantage, which means you should not vote for the plan. So that's a pretty commonly accepted category of argument, even though it doesn't actually fit into the you know, harms, solvency, inherency, topicality model of stock issues. It's still kind of an issue. In other forms of debate, sometimes people will say counterplans, the negative, the affirmative has a proposal to solve a problem, the negative should be able to get another proposal to solve the problem. Maybe that proposal has to be outside of the topic, maybe it doesn't. Maybe the affirmative could say both of them are good ideas. This is a huge category of argument. It has a lot of strategic complexity to it, and it's bigger than stock issues. But my point right now is that it's kind of outside of the realm of stock issues. In some forms of debate for the last couple of decades, there's been a kind of argument called a critique, which is basically, there's a lot of things that you could call critiques, but it's kind of an argument from principle or from a thesis. Like if you accept a certain worldview, then maybe you'd either say the plan's a bad idea, or you'd say the desirability of the plan isn't really the question that we ought to address. So imagine a world where President George W. Bush proposes invading Iraq, and where the Democratic Party proposes that Bush's presidency isn't legitimate because of irregularities in the year 2000 election. That's not really a disadvantage to invading Iraq, but it's kind of a way to sort of change the fundamental underlying question at hand, and it is a fairly common political strategy. I don't think that example is emblematic of everything that people could do to call it a critique. I'm just trying to say that critiques as a category of argument are sort of outside of the stock issues paradigm, and they're going to get their own lecture later on because they're big and weird. Sometimes judges will say that they want to look at stock issues primarily. Sometimes judges will say that they need to look at something else. So a lot of ways that judges might think about rounds may not really focus very much on stock issues. And if you happen to have a judge that has indicated that they plan to look at something else instead of stock issues, it's probably a good idea to pay attention to it. Now, the official National Federation Code of Ethics endorses specifically the stock issues perspective. In fact, under Category 11 Lincoln-Douglas debate, Rules A, it says the official decision-making paradigm of the NFA-LD is that of stock issues, harm, advantage or goals, inherency, solvency, and topicality. The affirmative is required to propose a plan that meets 4 initial burdens. It need not be detailed, but it should be sufficient to prove the propensity to solve the problem area. And then it says the affirmative must prove harm, inherency, probability of solving the area, and that it is topical. And that the negative could attack any of those issues and only need one to win the debate. So in a sense, you could say that NFA-LD as a particular kind of debate has a substantial focus on these stock issues, and thus understanding what these stock issues are is really critical to understanding the strategy and practice of NFA debate, which is why we've had a discussion about it today. I want to thank you very much for listening to this more detailed exploration of stock issues, and I will see you soon.